Merhaba, Shalom, and welcome to the exciting new podcast Israel and Palestine Unpacked that is dedicated to exploring the complexities of the ongoing political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. In today's episode, we are speaking with Dr Erika Jiménez, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the School of Law and a Mitchell Institute Fellow, Queen's University Belfast. Dr Jiménez has just published a book called Rethinking Human Rights, Critical Insights from Palestinian Youth, which looks at how Palestinian teenagers from the West Bank make sense of human rights when their lived experiences outside of the school environment contrast with what they learn about human rights within the school setting. Erika is currently leading a research project entitled Golani Youth, Human Rights in the Forgotten Occupation, which explores how the occupation impacts the lives of youth from the remaining Druze communities in the Golan Heights and their views on the usefulness of human rights. It compares their perspectives with older generations and those of their Palestinian peers in the West Bank, drawn on her previous research, but also new insights from the refugee community. This project is funded by the Leverhulme Trust and is being done alongside Golani and Palestinian youth advisory groups and researchers, and with support from local NGOs. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Jiménez's academic work, please look in the description below for more details. I do hope that you find this episode of Israel and Palestine Unpacked informative, and if you would like to receive more content, you are welcome to subscribe and join us as we journey together to gain insightful perspectives and knowledge. This interview with Dr. Jiménez delves into her new book, Rethinking Human Rights, Critical Insights from Palestinian Youth, where she talks about the gap between how human rights are taught and how Palestinian youth actually experience them. She further offers insights into their perspectives on dehumanization as well as their views on Israelis, before discussing whether these young Palestinians still regard human rights as an effective means for achieving justice and peace in their society over a decade later. However, before we arrive at these themes, we began our discussion by exploring the motivations and methods employed in her research.
I went to the south of Israel to teach English as an additional language on a voluntary basis to a Bedouin community. And whilst I was there, I ended up taking an unscheduled trip to the occupied West Bank. And me and some of my friends ended up getting lost. And we were supposed to be meeting some people at the University of Hebron. But we'd driven past Hebron without realizing it, and we ended up lost. And when I phoned them, they said, "Where are you? Describe what you can see." And I saw an Israeli watchtower, and I tried to describe what I could see, and they straight away said, "Oh, you're outside Al-Arub refugee camp. Stay there. We have a friend who lives in the refugee camp. She's going to come out and meet you." And to be honest, I didn't have an informed view of the so-called conflict, but I remember feeling a bit nervous about being lost outside a refugee camp in the West Bank as a Westerner. And as I reflected on that over the years, I think I realized that a lot of that was because of the post 9/11 war on terror rhetoric and the way the media had portrayed Palestinians in the Israel-Palestine relations, and that I had probably consumed that and in some ways been influenced by that, even if I hadn't really realized it. And I remember going into the refugee camp and being welcomed by this old lady, and she was so hospitable and so welcoming, served us tea and snacks, and wasn't in a rush at all. In fact, she ended up showing us around the refugee camp. And whilst we were outside a shop in this refugee camp, I remember seeing a group of pupils or students coming out of the school and walking down the corridor, which was really overcrowded. And I remember asking this lady, can you tell me what's going on here? As I saw another group kind of going towards the school. And she explained to me that the school operated on shifts. I just started to think about, what does education look like for Palestinian refugees? when it's being run by the UN? What does it look like when they're living in these sorts of conditions, but they're maybe learning about human rights in school, but this maybe contrasts with their everyday lived experiences. And then I went back home to Wales, and I remember thinking, I really need to learn more about this situation. I need to learn more about the Palestinian-Israeli context. And that was my sort of journey and towards learning and probably unlearning a lot of what I knew, what little I did know. So my research, I conducted research in the West Bank in 2015, which was a few months after the 2014 Gaza war. So this was very much at the forefront of a lot of the young people and the teachers I spoke to, their minds at the time. I wanted to find out about the different ways that Palestinian youth understood, talked about, and used human rights. I interviewed around 96 Palestinian teenagers and their educators, such as teachers and principals from a range of socioeconomic and religious backgrounds. So this meant that some were Muslim, some were Christian, some were maybe from these backgrounds, but they were secular. It also meant that a lot of the young people and the educators were from cities, villages, and refugee camps. So I spoke to youth who attended private schools, government-run and UN-run schools. For anonymity reasons, I can't say exactly where in the West Bank the research took place, but the schools were in areas A of the West Bank, which is under the Palestinian Authority's control, technically, though you will have military raids happening in the camps in these areas. So some of the young people would have lived outside these areas controlled by the PA, but they may have travelled through military checkpoints to get to school because their schools were inside areas A. As well as doing focus groups with youth, I also did interviews with teachers, and I also observed lessons where they were teaching about human rights, and I also analysed some of the teaching resources that were being used.
In your research, did you find a difference between how human rights were taught in the schools and how Palestinian youth experience them outside of the school setting?
Yeah, so just by way of context, Palestinian children learn about human rights, whether they attend a private school, a government-run, or a UN-run school. But there can be some differences across how human rights are taught across these schools. So private schools tend to enjoy more autonomy when it comes to the curriculum. And so there can be quite a bit of variation across these schools. The private school that was in my research included lessons about human rights in subjects such as ethics and religious education. There was also an emphasis on nurturing a rights-respecting culture inside the school. This was also the case in the UN schools. So UN schools provide education for children who live in refugee camps. They follow the same curriculum as the government schools, but they supplement the curriculum in certain areas. And this would include human rights. So they use their own material and they try and integrate education about human rights across the curriculum. So you might be in a science lesson and they'll try and apply certain concepts to human rights, which is really creative and really fascinating. Unsurprisingly, their human rights education is quite UN-centric, which means there's an emphasis on teaching children about human rights as codified in international law. So that will be the declarations and conventions on different rights. Government schools, they learn about human rights in civics education or citizenship education, as it would be known here. And they also learn about international human rights instruments, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. To be fair, Palestinian children and young people know a lot about human rights, and they could rhyme off articles from these declarations and conventions from memory. But they were also acutely aware of how the ideals they were learning about at school contrasted with their everyday lived experiences outside school. But a lot of them saw their schools as a haven from the rights violations that they often experienced when they stepped outside the school gates. When I spoke to the young people, they identified three main layers of marginalization, or three main obstacles when it comes to their human rights. The first obstacle was the Israeli occupation that denies them their rights and their humanity as Palestinians. The second obstacle that they talked about was the Palestinian pseudo-state, or the way the powerful or the Palestinian Authority security forces deny non-elites a voice or oppress them when they attend demonstrations or through bureaucratic means. The third obstacle that they talked about was the patriarchal aspects of the culture that prevented youth more generally, and girls specifically, from exercising agency. So this might have come into play when they were wanting to talk about politics and not having their voices or opinions given due weight or taken seriously. So a lot of the time, the young people were very familiar with how what they were learning in school didn't face up or didn't match up to what they were experiencing the moment they stepped out of school gates.
Can you tell me a little bit about how Palestinian youth described dehumanization?
So both the young people and their teachers from all these different backgrounds, both religiously, socioeconomically, they all talked about how they, as Palestinians, have been dehumanized, especially in discussions on Israel-Palestine relations. And they also believe that this has come to be kind of accepted globally, that it's kind of normal to dehumanize Palestinians, and that they're somehow ranked lower than other humans across the world. One of the ways that the young people expressed this was through comparing their lives to that of animals. I remember one girl saying, "It's funny how animals have more rights than humans in Palestine." And she went on to say, we're not equal, we're different from other children in the world. There was also this idea that a Palestinian's life was ranked lower than the lives of others. I remember another girl from a refugee camp saying that, in Western countries, if someone dies, they make a massive issue of it. And it is a big issue. But if we Palestinians were killed, whether it was 100 to 1,000, then it's normal and okay. Palestinians are numbers. And I think one of the things that we've seen more recently is how Palestinians are routinely dehumanized. During the current war, we've heard Israeli officials dehumanizing Palestinians, for example, saying that we're fighting human animals, or talking about Palestinians as children of darkness rather than children of light. But history's shown us that this sort of dehumanizing rhetoric often precedes acts of genocide. I remember a teacher telling me, describing occupation in the West Bank as being like rats in a hole. People watch us, that we're trying to live, but we're in a prison. We're trying to let the whole world see that we are people, we are humans. Another way that a lot of the young people, especially the boys, talked about how they've been dehumanized was by talking about how Palestinians have been given the label of Islamic terrorists, or as the violent partner in the Israel-Palestine relations. And again, we know that labeling a group of people as terrorists it's become quite an effective way of dehumanizing a people or an individual and delegitimizing any political aims that they have. I would also argue that the situation is asymmetrical, and many would argue that Palestinians are not even a warring side in a conflict, but they're engaged in what is called an anti-colonial struggle.
I understand that for most Palestinian youth, their only experience of meeting Israelis is through checkpoints and soldiers, and on occasion with settlers. From your research, how do you think the Palestinian youth perceived Israelis? Did they draw distinctions, or did they see Israelis as monolithic?
Yeah, so the young people that I interviewed went to school in areas A of the West Bank, which, as I mentioned earlier, is controlled by the PA and is officially off bounds for Israelis. So most of the young people that I spoke to, their encounters with Israelis would have been with soldiers, either at checkpoints or during military raids that take place in refugee camps. But unsurprisingly, there wasn't a singular view on this. Many were keen to make a distinction between Jews and Zionists, and they wanted to make it really clear to anyone who would read the research. I remember one boy drawing on a post-it note, Jews, and then a line, and then underneath Zionists. And he said, I really want people to know that we make a difference between a Jew and a Zionist. There were quite a few young people, especially girls from the refugee camp, who talked about that they acknowledged that many Jewish people stand in solidarity with them. I was working with a group of Palestinian girls from a refugee camp the other week as part of my current research project. And again, they were talking about how many from the Jewish community have been vocal and have opposed the war on Gaza, are speaking out against the occupation, and how much they really appreciate that solidarity from the Jewish community. So they do really recognize and acknowledge that not all Jewish people maybe uphold a Zionist ideology. Youth often spoke about being opposed to this Zionist ideology and those whose vision of a Zionist homeland means the displacement of Indigenous Palestinians. So this actually challenged some of the ideas that we often hear, or these narratives that Palestinians are brainwashed into hating Jewish people, or that their school curriculum incites hatred towards Jewish people. In fact, I'd actually argue that there's quite a lot of reverence among Palestinians, especially the Muslims, for the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Some of the young people did make a distinction between civilians and soldiers, and others pointed out that the Israeli military doesn't differentiate between civilians and soldiers in their military campaigns, and that they often target women and children. This was when they were talking about the 2014 Gaza war. But what was really surprising, maybe to some listeners, I don't know, was that a lot of the young people maintained that human rights are universal. In other words, everyone should have human rights. Even if you don't behave in a human way, even their occupiers who violate their rights. And there were many young people who really were advocates of the universality of human rights, even despite their circumstances.
It's 2024. Your research was conducted after the conflict in 2014. That's a lot of water that has passed under the bridge since then. That's an entire decade. In light of the ongoing fighting in Gaza, do Palestinian youth still perceive human rights as a useful tool for bringing about a just and peaceful society, or has there been a shift in their perspective?
Well, I think it's important to start from the context that over the years, Palestinians have really used the language of human rights to articulate their struggle against the Israeli occupation and to communicate the injustices that they face in a kind of language or a rhetoric that the international community will understand, but also have to act on. So human rights have always been a very important tool in the Palestinian struggle. But over the years, especially following the Oslo Accords in the 1990s or the peace talks, cynicism towards the potential for human rights to bring about justice began to increase. Now, this was down to a number of factors that I don't have time to go into, but that included the establishment of the PA and the shift from political mobilization in a more institutionalized form, the influx of foreign aid, certain donors only promising to fund less sensitive topics, an emphasis on peace and coexistence rather than maybe rights and struggle. Also, because a lot of human rights organizations have failed to end human rights abuses, and also because of the lack of intervention from the international community. So this was the context when I was talking to youth 9 years ago. But a lot of the young people said then that they were more optimistic than adults when it came to the role of human rights in addressing the layers of injustices that they experienced. Unsurprisingly, we're talking about 2024, and cynicism in the potential for human rights to deliver justice for the Palestinians has skyrocketed since October 7. I actually spoke to youth from a refugee camp the other week as part of my current project, and they said that youth used to be more optimistic about human rights and about the possibility of human rights being a tool to bring about a more peaceful society for them. But they said now everyone is pessimistic because of the war. Some described human rights, the human rights system, the human rights discourse as a silly joke. It's a game to manipulate us, one of them said. And they said no one is optimistic about human rights, especially after the genocide. So I think Israel's disregard for international and human rights law in its military campaign at the moment, and also the complicity of Western leaders in this war, is once more undermined the legitimacy of the West as the so-called champions of human rights. And the fragility of international law has been laid bare once again. I listened to the Reverend Dr. Isaac's Christmas message last year, and I think he captured what some of the young people have been saying to me in recent weeks, when he said that to our European friends, I never want to hear you lecture us again about human rights or international law. We are not white. It does not apply according to your logic. Despite the overwhelming cynicism towards human rights, the system, the language, the idea that it is a tool that can bring about emancipation or justice, I will end with this. The youth I spoke to back in 2015 and the young people that I'm interviewing at the moment all emphasize that they still want their voices to be heard to people abroad, and that they want their humanity to be recognized, and that irrespective of how the international community responds or does not respond, they will not stop speaking up.
As we come to the end of this interview, I would like to give my thanks to Dr. Jiménez for taking the time to speak to us here at Israel and Palestine Unpacked about her work. Her research offers new insights into how Palestinian youth in parts of the West Bank understand human rights as a set of principles and how they differ in practice. However, before we close for today, I would like to announce that in early 2025 we'll be shifting focus and looking specifically at the important role that Jerusalem plays between both Palestinians and Israelis. We will continue to delve into the experiences and views of the people who make up the city, offering a personal yet intimate look at daily life in this deeply contested space. Additionally, we will examine the key issues such as the important historical attachment that both peoples have towards this city and how this has shaped their identities. This includes the development of settlements, evictions, and the stumbling block that the city has become for any possible future peace agreements. Through these discussions, we hope to unpack the various components that make Jerusalem such a pivotal and emotional focal point. In our next episode, we will be interviewing Dr. Uri Rosenberg, a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at Heidelberg University, Germany, with a PhD in Middle East history from Tel Aviv University. In the upcoming episode, we are speaking about his activism and hands-on experience in Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. Until then, what's left to say is thank you for joining us, and if you have any feedback or comments, feel free to share your perspective by getting in touch via email at israelpalestineunpacked, all one word, @gmail.com, or alternatively via our Facebook page. All contact information can be found below in the description. I hope that you'll join me next time on Israel and Palestine Unpacked.